Okay, hello all you crazy people out there. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. Let's talk about 3D games in GameMaker. So this is a 3D scene. We've got an object, we've got some balls, they've got some shading on them so you can see a light coming on them from one angle. This is a pretty basic 3D scene. We are currently rendering a couple of vertex buffers to the graphics card, and the graphics card is in turn figuring out where on the screen each of those vertex buffers should be, and also what color information they should carry. This, however, is by no means the only information you could render to the screen, and in the coming weeks and months, and honestly probably years at the rate that I get these videos out, I am going to start talking about some of the other information that you could render to the screen using a shader. If you recall, about a year ago I made a handful of videos on toon shader effects, and part of that involved a post-processing effect involving figuring out where outlines around objects should be. And the way we did that was by, instead of rendering the diffuse color information to a surface, we rendered instead the normal information, and I believe some depth information to a surface. And then drawing that surface using another shader, using a Sobel filter. That's one application. I've also said the words deferred rendering a handful of times. Deferred rendering is a whole thing that I have yet to dig down deep into. I promise I will someday. Today, let's dedicate a little bit more attention to rendering depth to a surface. So, if you want to draw a scene, and you want, instead of having the regular diffuse color information, or in our case, the final shaded version of a scene to a surface, you could create yourself a new shader. I'm going to create myself a new shader. Actually, let me duplicate basic 3D stuff. I'm going to call this shd_depth. I'm going to shader set this when we draw the scene instead of the basic 3D stuff, which was basically the not very fancy 3D light. I can leave the vertex shader alone. I can go into the fragment shader. Instead of calculating all this to figure out 3D lighting and that sort of thing, I am going to instead delete all this. I'm going to delete all this, I said. And first, before we do anything else, let's just set gl_frag color equal to a single vector 4. Let's make everything vec 4. 1 on the red, 0 green, 0 blue, 1 on the alpha. This is going to be a solid red. This is simply going to cause everything that we try to draw to be drawn with a solid red color. Apparently not. Am I actually, using that shader? I am not, because that should be set in here instead of in this block of code here. Let me get rid of that. Not sure what that was doing here. So let's render the entire scene to a solid red color. Okay, wow, that's a little bit more intense than I expected it to be. Probably should have picked a different color. Better than magenta? Not by much. So a very, I don't know why having this recent Windows tab open in videos bothers me, and just in general. It's just it's a tab that I never use, and it just takes up space, which kind of annoys me. Anyway, so if we hop on over to the fragment shader, or to the vertex shader rather, for a quick moment. There's a couple simple ways that you might try and go about getting depth information and writing that to a color. One, I can get rid of all these varyings. I do not need all these varyings. I can just, leave that there. For one, and I've actually done this in videos in the past for just a quick and dirty solution to having depth in the fragment shader, you could do a little calculation that looks a little bit like this gl_position expression here. You could say, instead of matrix worldview projection times the object space position, you could just multiply the worldview matrix by the object space position. You could call this vec for distance is going to equal, let's say, for example, the length of the x, y, z component of this vector. And you could pass this to the fragment shader using a varying. Let's call this varying. This is just going to be a simple float. Let's call this v_distance to camera. And then we could say v_distance to camera equals, instead of just going the roundabout way, let's just put the result of this calculation directly into that varying. And then in the fragment shader, we could take this varying, and instead of having all this nonsense, we could say gl_frag color is going to equal a vec4 of, let me say vec3 depth color is going to equal vec3 the varying of the distance to the camera, and the vector 4 that is gl_frag color is just going to be depth color, and it is going to have an alpha of 1. And this is a very basic way that you can render depth to a surface. you'll notice that the screen is almost entirely white. If I were to put my face real close to another surface, you might be able to catch it changing color from black to gray to white. But that's going to be a little bit difficult because color channels in shaders range from 0 to 1. So as soon as the fragment that we're drawing is more than 1 unit away from my camera, it's going to be completely white. And unless you can like get your camera real close to a surface, you won't really be able to see that. Instead, what you might do is you might divide this by something like 1,000. Divide the distance to the camera by 1,000, and then we're going to have a little bit more of a grayscale scene. We're going to effectively have fragments that are real close to us being black, fragments that are far away from us being white. Specifically, this over here, where it turns to complete white, that is about 1,000 distance units away from our camera. And everything in the middle is some shade of gray. So the balls, as they get farther away from me, as I back up, they turn from gray to white. The pirate ship, as I get farther away from it, turns gray to white until I'm about 1,000 distance units away, and it's just completely white. This is a little bit more useful to us. This conveys a little bit more information. If you wanted to reverse this, if you wanted to sample from the texture that we're drawing onto later on to figure out how far away each fragment is from the camera, you could take the color value and multiply it by 1,000, and that would give you the original distance.
Hey.
It's not perfect. When this color is put into the surface that we're drawing on, it's only going to have 8 bits of precision. Each of the red, green, and blue color channels, when GameMaker renders them to a surface, is just going to be converted into an 8-bit number, so an 8-bit byte, 0 through 255. And then as a result, when we try to sample that color later, we're only going to have 8 bits of precision when it comes to figuring out how far away the camera is or something. In fact, if you look real closely, you might be able to see, if you look real closely at like the ground, you might be able to see some amount of banding. If I were to zoom in on around here, around the ground, you can sort of make out where the colors actually change because of the limited precision that we have. So that's not great. This can work in some basic situations, like if you have a toon shader and you just want to be able to draw an outline around some object. You might not need that great of a degree of precision when it comes to figuring out how far each fragment is away from something else. If you're doing something a little bit more elaborate, that might not necessarily fly. So there's a couple things that I'm going to do to upgrade this. One is I'm going to commit this to GitHub, and I'm going to call this something like very basic rendering depth to a surface. The first thing I'm going to do is actually hop on back over to the vertex shader. I am going to use a slightly different calculation for this v_distance to camera varying. Instead of getting the length of this matrix worldview times object space position vector, I am going to instead set this to a slightly different expression. I'm going to say gl_position.z divided by gl_position.w. The x and y components of gl position are the horizontal and vertical components of the vector representing the fragment's position on the screen. Z is going into the screen, so it's more or less how far away from the camera the fragment is, and w is the homogeneous coordinate. If you divide glposition.z by glposition.w, I do not remember off the top of my head the exact value that this represents, but I believe it is a value ranging from 0 to 1, where 0 is the camera's near clipping plane and 1 is the camera's far clipping plane. For more information about the camera's clipping plane, see a video that I did a few weeks ago about that. Now, if I were to run the game just using this, you would not see very much at all. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to move the mouse cursor around, and I have no idea where I am because the entire screen is just black. Yeah, I have no idea where I am. There's a little more we have to do, so if I hop back over to the Fragment Shader, just out of curiosity, and I'm not going to keep this, but if I were to just not divide by 1,000, would I actually have... Okay, so we have sort of... It's not super helpful, but we have color at least. You can actually see it changing color as I move around. That's interesting. Anyway, the second major problem with the original version of this depth rendering that I had is that we have 3 values, red, green, and blue, that we can play with. Each of those values are 8 bits. Together, that's 24 bits of color information that each fragment has, not counting alpha, because alpha is kind of its own special thing. And we are currently only using 8. We are setting the distance to camera value to the same value on red, green, and blue. we are effectively only using one of those color components, and we are not making use of the 24 bits. We are only making use of the 8 bits. And you may wish to, instead of doing that, you may wish to actually make use of all of the 24 bits of the red, green, and blue color information that you have, that you can render to a surface. And to do that, you can do a little bit of arithmetic. You can essentially break down the distance to camera value, and you can split that up into pieces for each of the red, green, and blue color components.
Hey.
So let me create myself a function. This function is going to return a vector 3. I'm going to call it toDepthColor. This function is going to take a float depth as an input, and it is going to return a vector 3, which is going to represent a color which contains information based on the depth. First, let me define a float long depth, and I really need to make up my mind whether I'm going to use camel case or snake case for all my values in this shader. This is going to be equal to the input parameter depth multiplied by 16,777,215.0. 16,777,215 is a magic number that some of you may recognize as 2 to the 24 minus 1. It tends to come up a lot when you're dealing with binary numbers in GameMaker, and when you're dealing with things like 24-bit color values and other such things. Perhaps that's a story for another time. Next, I'm going to define myself a vector 3. I am going to call this... I need a good name for this. Let me call this depth as color. This is going to equal a vector 3, obviously. On the first component of this vector 3, we are going to have... we're going to use the mod function. We're going to long depth mod 256.0. Mod function, I don't remember if I've talked about this in a video in the past. This is essentially the same as doing the calculation in something like GML, the depth value mod via the % sign 256. GML also gives you the mod keyword that you can use instead of just the % sign. For whatever reason, and to this day I do not know why this is, OpenGL, the OpenGL shader language, and also HLSL shader language, does not offer an operator to use for modular division. Instead, you have to do it with a function like this. I am not sure why they chose to do this. Other operators in GLSL work with vectors and integers and that sort of thing, vectors and floats and whatever. Anyway, this is going to take the long depth value. So this thing up here, it's going to do modular division on it with 256. So we are going to have the remainder of this value divided by 256. You can think of this as the lower 8 bits if this was an integer. This is a floating point number rather than an integer, so it's not quite that straightforward. But regardless. So the second value in this vector 3 is going to be similar. It is going to be mod long depth divided by 256.0. So it's going to be 1/256th of this long depth value, modulo 256.0. And the third and final value is going to be no mod function for this one. This is just going to be long depth divided by 65,536.0. Semicolon. 65,536.0 is another magic number that some of you may recognize. Is it really a magic number if it has an actual meaning? Anyway, 65,536 is 2 raised to the 16th, also known as 256 times 256. So if this first value is the lower 8 bits of the depth value, as if it was an integer, the second value is going to be the middle 8 bits, and the third value is going to be whatever's left, the upper 8 bits, if this was a 24-bit integer. So we're not quite done. We're still going to need to do a little bit more to this vector before we can return it. I'm just breaking this up over multiple lines because I don't want it to be super long and weird. Actually, with that in mind, let me maximize this code window so there's slightly more space. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to floor depth as color. So each of these values in this vector 3 are going to be rounded down, and we can reassign that to ourselves as a new value. And lastly, we can also depth as color divided by 255.0. So at this point in the code, each of the components in this vector 3 are going to be in a range of 0 to 255. And then we simply want to divide that result by 255 to put each of those values in a range of 0 to 1, which the computer will recognize as a color value. You can reassign it like this. You can reassign depth as color equals depth as color divided by 255. If that's a little bit verbose for you, you can slash equals 255. You could, of course, do this entire calculation all in one line, which I have chosen not to do. And once we're done with this, let us return depth as color. And then back in the Fragment Shader's main function, instead of doing what we were doing before, let us set the red, green, and blue color components of GL frag color to depth color. The depth value is going to be the varying that we had before. The alpha is going to be 1. And this is going to give us a rather interesting... and I'm not going to turn the camera yet, but you can sort of see it in the corner of the screen. This is going to give us a rather interesting picture. So, oh man, that is something, isn't it? So, up close, this is like... Should I not do that? Should I, like, put an epilepsy warning on this video because this is kind of a little bit intense? Maybe I'll just, like, stand here and take my hand off the keyboard so that we don't have a lot of colors flashing around. So we can see that what we have now is that we have gone from a grayscale image with a small amount of banding at the beginning of the video to a full color image, which has an awful lot of banding. I realize this probably looks super weird if you've never seen it before, but this actually makes sense. We have a lot more precision in the depth value that we're rendering to the surface. We are making use of all 24 of the bits of the color information that we have. And you can see that, and I'm gonna apologize and then start moving around again. You can see that when I am very close to something on the screen, we are going from more or less blue to magenta. And the transition is rather smooth. It's not like before when we had just a discrete gray stripe and then beyond it a discrete slightly lighter gray stripe and then so on and so forth until it got to white. If I were to look up, again I'm sorry, and back up, we can see that as I back up, the image is going to get slightly greener, and then if I get far enough away, it should get slightly redder at an immense distance. You can see it's starting to get yellow as I look at it from all the way back here, and it should turn red, I believe.
Hey.
I think that's far enough for me. Anyway, this is only half the story. One, do I want to encourage good code habits? Do I want to put this 16,777,215 into, like, a define or something like that? I'll put it in a constant value. Let's say const depth scale factor. This needs to be a float. Depth scale factor is going to equal this. This is just its own constant. I feel like 256 and 255 and that kind of thing are recognizable enough that anyone reading this code should be able to figure out what the significance of those numbers are, but 2 to the 24th minus 1, I will not make that assumption. And this will compile, right? Sometimes, yeah, there we go. Sometimes shaders can be a little bit weird about how they want you to, like, define your constants and that sort of thing. Anyway, this here is only half the story. If you were to sample from this texture later on, you would most likely want to be able to turn this red, green, blue color value into actual depth information again. And I'm not going to do anything that will make use of this right now. I will in several future videos. But if you want to reverse this calculation, you could either just essentially work through it backwards, arithmetically, the way that you probably did in math class in high school. Let's see. Or you can make use of some of the built-in functionality that shaders have, namely the dot product. Let me define myself a second function. This is not actually going to get used anywhere in this code, but it will be float depth from color. It's going to take an input of a vec3 color. This is essentially going to be the inverse of this function. First, let me define myself my own vector3, a vector3 of my own. We can call this vec3. Out of lack of better things to call this, let's just call this undo. This is going to be equal to a vector3. This is going to be composed of a few values. I'm just going to run through this without really stopping to explain it until I'm at the end. The first one is going to be 1.0. The second one is going to be 256.0. The third one is going to be our old friend 65,536.0. All this is going to be divided by 16,777,215.0, and it's going to be multiplied by 255.0. And then, instead of doing any long and tedious function inverses, we can return the dot product of color against undo. So using the dot product to do this may be slightly counterintuitive at first, until you realize that the dot product is just multiplying the components of both of these vectors together. And with this particular set of inputs, this dot product calculation just essentially saves you the trouble of multiplying the input color by 255 and then algebraically reversing this calculation, which would be not impossible and probably not difficult as long as you are somewhat familiar with high school mathematics. But the ability to do it in a single dot product function call is very nice. And as with the depth scale factor up here, if you want to, since this is not a value that's ever going to change, you may prefer to make this a constant vector 3, and we can put it in screaming case, so that we remember that it's a constant, and use that instead of having to calculate this every time the fragment shader runs. Anyway, that is rendering depth to a texture. I am going to, as I said, I'm not going to be making use of inverting this right now, but I will soon enough in a future video. I'm going to be talking about shadow mapping, and this is suddenly going to become rather important. I am going to commit this change. Rendering depth to a surface the good way. I'm going to stop now. Another very common thing that you might want to do that is very similar to this is rendering surface normals to the screen. And that is not going to be something that's immediately useful to any of the videos that I plan on doing soon, but it is very similar, and I'm probably going to make another video on it, either possibly later today or next week or something, just to have it in the repertoire, just to have that squared away for when I do inevitably decide to talk about deferred rendering in the future. Anyway, that's it. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. I aim to post about 2-ish game dev videos a week, so if you're interested in the weirder parts of GameMaker, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, you can find a link to that in all the usual places. You could see your name in the credits, hear yourself shouted out at the end, you could see a bit of a preview of my future plans, that kind of thing. Otherwise, if you want the code for this, there will be a link to a GitHub repository down in the video description. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Edward Holt, Posho, Emily Koyo, Tusk, Sindra Larson, Gunnar Clovis, Squarecrow, and Azarel Studios for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or hear yourself shouted out at the end, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.